As we know, Mistika is a complete finishing tool, so we've had a look at editing and color grading. So in the next set of tutorials we'll have a look at compositing. What we'll do in this tutorial is we'll have a quick overview of the main features of compositing in Mistika, so consider it a quick start guide if you like for compositing. We'll go into more detail about the individual effects and components in the following tutorials. Now, as we know, compositing is the art of selecting part of a frame and then doing something to it, or cutting it out and putting it on a different background. So we can generally break Mistika's tools into one of three groups, and they're all under the FX tab. There are tools that are designed to help you select part of a frame, such as selecting by color or drawing around an object. Then there are tools that are designed to refine that selection, such as blurring edges or processing edges. And then there are tools that are designed to do something with that selection, such as affect that area or composite. So let's straight away look at a very basic standard compositing layout. So what I have here is a TIFF file that has a built-in alpha channel. Now, from looking at the timeline, how do I know that it has an alpha channel on it? Well, actually I don't. The only way I can find out is if I double click it, I can look in my view here and look at the alpha channel, and I can see that there's something of the same shape. So the alpha channel is a parallel image channel that defines our selection, and in this case this has been pre-supplied for us. So to simply composite this biplane over this sky, we would set up a basic compositing stack, and in Mistika it looks like this. So as you can see, we now have the plane composited over the background. So what I've used here is an effect called Comp 3D from the effects panel, which is here, and the name actually tells us the two things that it does. It's a compositor insofar as it takes a background picture and a picture with an alpha channel and combines the two together. The 3D part doesn't necessarily refer to stereoscopic. It refers to the fact that the compositing takes place in a virtual 3D environment where pictures can be placed in an X, Y and Z or Z location. So as you can see, I've not changed any parameters, and just by default the compositor will take two inputs and key one over the other. Now at this point you might be considering this is upside down, in that Mistika, as we know, works from a top-down perspective. So we would have thought that the foreground would sit on top of the background. And actually in a compositing node like this, the first input is the background. The second input is the first composited layer. So yes, in one respect it's upside down, but that's the way it is. If we double click on Comp 3D to have a look at some of its parameters, we can see it's got many parameters, and we'll go through all of these in a future tutorial. So let's close all that up before it gets too scary. But a couple of key concepts just to get going. We can see that our first input is the background and our second input is layer 1. So if I select layer 1, I can now manipulate this layer. So just by left mouse or tap down pen, I can move around. Holding down Control will give me scale, holding down Alt will give me rotation, and of course if I have Auto key on, I can create some animation. Within the layer, if I open up the folders, we can see that it's subdivided into various functions, and again we'll do a tutorial and look at these all in detail. But obviously at the moment I've been playing with the transformation, which are all available on a graph, as is usual for everything on Mistika. There's the key mode, so on this I'd probably use pre-multiplied to get a better transparency on the propeller. And there's also the blend, which is the opacity of the layer. So I'm just going to delete that to go back to its standard settings. If we now go back to the timeline, what I'll do is add in a second layer. And I do this by adding in another image and just making sure that the scope of the effect encompasses that other input. Now if I go back into the Compose window, of course we've got those two planes, but they're sitting perfectly on top of each other. And in fact, if I point to layer 1 and move, we're moving both of them. The reason being is that until I specify here that I have a second layer, any excess input is simply combined onto the one layer. So in this instance, I'm going to go folder, add folder, and now I have two layers. So you can see now I have two planes. So if I make the second one smaller just so we can see it, you'll notice that by default you can see how the second plane, the smaller plane, is in front of the first plane. This is the natural hierarchy of how things are composed. Because these are flat images, and if I rotate the camera position we can see that those two images are exactly on top of each other. So the priority goes to the highest number layer. However, as soon as I change the position of this layer to be further backwards, so I'll take the Z position and drag it away, you can see straight away it goes properly behind layer 1. So then the ordering becomes a priority of depth. And you can see that they will react together in a 3D kind of a way, hence Comp3D. So that's the very basic layout of compositing. Now let's look at how we get alpha channels if we haven't been provided with an image with an embedded alpha channel like this. So I'm just going to delete these and just go back to a default. So the first common thing is we're provided with a foreground and a matte in a separate file or image, and so we want to combine one onto the other. Well, actually there's a simple effect to do that. To combine a foreground and a matte, we use this effect from effects called external key. So if we look at the stack here, if I look at the biplane directly, we can see that it does not have an alpha channel. However, when we go up to the external key, it's grabbed the alpha channel from its second input. So external key is the method of taking a video input and a second video input that contains the alpha channel, and the result then is a combination with foreground and alpha channel. So this will now work in that comp exactly as it did work with an embedded alpha channel. So we've seen how we work with a matte if we're provided with one. So let's look at a couple of tools to help us create a matte if we don't have one. So let's delete this. So let's say I wanted to create a matte from this based on keying on luminance. Well, then under the effects tab I would use RGB key, which is a method of generating an alpha channel from the luminance. So again, if we look at the alpha channel, we can see it's made a start, and I can either control the keying levels from these markers, or I could use something from the GUI. So pick transparent is obviously going to be black, pick solid is going to be sort of these parts. So within the Mistika timeline, what we're now saying is this clip doesn't have an alpha channel, but this effect is creating an alpha channel for it, which means by the time it gets into the compositor sees the output of this, which is the foreground video plus the alpha channel that we've created. Alternatively, we might not be able to key from colors or luminance. We might have to draw around things. So in which case every clip and every effect on Mistika's timeline has the ability to have shapes. So let's just go back to the plane on grey, and as we can see, because this doesn't have an alpha channel at all, it's not being cut out. But what we can do is go to shapes and draw an alpha channel. So again, we'll have a proper tutorial on shapes, but generally to start I'd say that I want to clear the existing alpha channel and I want to create a shape adding to our new empty alpha channel. So with a smooth shape, start creating a really wonderful, highly accurate matte, maybe. Double click to finish the shape. So now if we look at our alpha channel, we can see we've created a shape. And if we look at our composite, we see we're cutting out with that shape. And the shapes have various controls to keyframe them. They can be tracked. They can have softness applied to them, and that softness can be on the inside or the outside of the shape. That can be chosen on a pixel by pixel basis as to what the softness does, even with tangents to specify exactly the range of softness that you need and the shape parameters. But we'll look at those in more detail in another tutorial. Of course, another classic thing we will want to do is to key on color, classic chroma keys. So let's quickly look at how we deal with that. There are actually a couple of different ways of working with chroma keys. If it's a classic green screen like this, we can shortcut to just use this green screen key here. And the first thing it will do, as you can see, is it's killed the green. And then we can go on to defining our alpha channel, which is simply a case of pick transparent and pick solid, which now gives us our key. Let's take off the shrink. And again, it's working because this particular clip, if we look at the alpha channels, this doesn't have an alpha channel, but the green screen is making one for it, which means by the time we get up to the comp, it's received the alpha channel from here, and in fact the color corrected foreground as well. We can see we've got some garbage here that we want to matte out as well. So the shapes can be used on any effect or clip, as I mentioned before. So in this case I might go to the green screen clip, go to shapes, but this time I don't want to clear the alpha, I want to keep the alpha that we've already got because that's the alpha channel that we've generated from the green screen, and instead I want to subtract my shape from that. So with sharp points on this one, I'll create a shape that does this and double click to finish. You can see it's got rid of that edge, because effectively what that was doing was deleting a part of the alpha channel. Using this method of image flow within Mistika, we can insert effects at various points in the stack to give us the controls that we need. For example, if I wanted to blur the alpha channel to make a better edge, then under effects, blur alpha channel. So now having got that node, I've now got a control over that blurred edge. At the moment we can see he's got a bit of a dark edge, and that's because the color of the green has been killed, neutralized to that shade of grey. But actually if we change that shade of grey, we can make that edge a little bit more pleasant. So that was done within the green screen itself, but of course there's nothing to stop me inserting a color corrector actually in my comp. So now, because my color corrector is on the end of the chain that creates the foreground image, then I can make my changes to the foreground without affecting the background. Also, because the changes are being made after the matte has been extracted, it doesn't matter if I went, say, entirely green, because the matte has already been done. And likewise, if I put a color corrector on the background, if I just separate this out to make it clearer what's going on. So we've got our compositor, we've got our background, which is going via a color corrector, and we've got our foreground, which is going through a green screen to get the alpha channel, then the alpha channel is being blurred, and then it's being color corrected. So by having the color correctors in different places, we can make very interactive adjustments on foregrounds and backgrounds. And the whole workflow within Mistika is to build these towers, adding the effects that you want until you get precisely the look that you need. So I've added in a blur, for example, to take the clouds out of focus. There's no limit to how high you can make these stacks, but sometimes you might want to manage your desktop a little bit. So perhaps when you're compositing you don't necessarily need the clips this big. You can drop them down so you can get more on a page. So let's go and find our biplane again. So I've stuck the biplane in as an extra layer, but because my compositor has only been told about one layer, the biplane is inheriting all the positional details of our man. So if I go folder, add folder, and now drop it back in Z space so it goes behind him. And now of course I can move that to be wherever I want it to be. And it can have its own set of parameters. So let's do a foreground blur on that one. If these stacks start to get quite big, groups help quite a lot. So I can group all of this down into a single track. Everything's still inside, page down. We saw this in a tutorial about groups earlier on. Or of course they can be ungrouped. Or you might want to use groups to define logical parts. For example, that is the background. That's layer 1. That's layer 2. You can see the comp is still working because the results of the groups are still picture and alpha channel. And sometimes it's easier to define things like this, especially since you can of course name these as well, which can sometimes make things a little easier. So that's a basic tour of the main compositing node, if you like, and along with a couple of ways of deriving alpha channels. There are a couple of other key items within the compositing tools of Mistika. For example, there's Vector Paint, which is a reasonably classic painting interface. So from here I select Paint, and so within Paint you have your usual sorts of brushes that you might work with. So perhaps you'd use something like this for classic retouching. So this is just cloning, the usual sorts of things you might get up to. The one specific thing about the paint is it's all vectorized. So if I go to a normal brush and draw a line, you can see straight away it's actually created a vector. So what that means is that I can create keyframes out of freehand shapes and animate them. And this is true for all brushes, not just a normal paintbrush. So of course we'll have a full tutorial on paint later on. But it's interesting how it works in the timeline. You can see here that the paint object is a node on a clip. So if I were to change the clip, the paint is now working on something else. So the paint stays independent to the clip that's being painted. Another item in the toolbox is the warper. The warper allows you to build a grid over images and warp things, as you'd expect. And in fact it has two inputs and two grids. So by matching one grid to another across two images, you can effect a classic morph. You can also make the mesh bespoke for the image that you're working on. So let's say I want to do something with the eyes. I might just select that row and add a line. So now I've added this line, which I'm just going to move down to be just above the eye. Add another line. Just going to mark out an area to change and to limit. So now I'll select a column and add a line. So you can see I can build a grid to just affect the area that I want to affect. But we'll look at warping in more detail another time. There are also various effects that work with alpha channels. For example, if I add a title to this frame, something big and bold. Now at the moment it's going on in the image channel, so we can see it. But under the parameters of title I can tell it to only apply to the mask channel. So it seems to disappear. It's just moved to the alpha channel. So now you can add on effects that work within the alpha channel, for example liquid bump, which does glass and refraction kind of effects based on the shape of the alpha channel. So hopefully that's given you a quick run through of how compositing works on the Mistika timeline. You can see that we build these processing towers that work in the context of our timeline. And you can see how we can seamlessly go in and out of nodes such as the color corrector within an interactive stack rather than having to export data into a different module. So over the next few tutorials we'll go into a lot more detail of the individual items and look at some of the ancillary functions such as motion tracking also.